I speak to you now in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So if I say the name Joshua Harris, I'm going to assume that most of you will have no idea who I'm talking about. And then there's maybe like 2 people for whom I just triggered like a PTSD crisis from memories of church youth group. So Joshua Harris is a guy who, like, back in the 90s, as a teenager himself, wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And this sparked off the whole like sexual purity culture movement in the evangelical church. And if you don't know about that, just, I promise, Google it. Worlds will be open to you. But he caused a lot of people pain, right? There's a lot of people who are very open about the fact that this movement, this teaching in the church, is a source of incredible trauma and pain for them. Years pass, and Joshua Harris himself becomes someone who is deconstructing his faith, to use, the terminology of the day. He's someone who's like, I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. This is no longer what I am. I'm finding myself outside of the evangelical church, which is all well and good. Good for him. But then, lo and behold, a couple weeks back, Joshua Harris decided to publish or offer a course that he would lead on, teaching people to deconstruct their faith. And he was charging like $300 something intro rate for the first tier of this Learn to Deconstruct Your Faith with Joshua Harris nonsense. And like, it's truly one of the most cathartic things I've seen in like online culture in a long time. The absolute backlash he received to this, it was kind of glorious. It was fantastic. And he backed out. He's like, okay, that was a bad idea. I'm not doing that anymore. But I think what it points to is this dynamic, right, that we see play out so often. Someone who was, he profited off the like Christian publishing industry. He had a platform. He wrote some things. He had got a lot of accolades. Step back from that, and then instead of sitting, listening, learning, understanding the people that he hurt, just turning that toxic, abusive platform in a new way and setting himself up once again as the authority to offer the model of wisdom. And I think it really speaks to something really important, because in that backlash he received, no one was really mad at Joshua Harris for the things that he had done in his past. Fine, you recognized that was wrong, you changed, you turned away from that. It was the persistence in setting himself up as the expert, the model, the wise teacher, rather than what he really needed to do, which was listen. And I think there's something really profound in that, right? That often what is so vital and important and what we are called to is not having everything right, but being called into the messiness and complexity and challenge and difficulty of actually listening, bearing with each other, understanding the implications of our own actions and behaviors on other people, right? And that whole dynamic gives me an interesting framework to approach Jesus and what is maybe one of the most frustrating and challenging stories that we have in the gospel. And to perhaps see in this text, yet again, what is being communicated to us about the gospel, about our calling, that once again, it is not some static place of perfection, spiritual, moral perfection that we are called to, or even that Jesus models for us, but being called into the dynamism and the complexity and the scariness of relationship, of openness to one another, and being challenged and transformed by that. So let us take a step back then and look at Jesus in this passage, because this is not the Jesus that we want to see. And this is not the Jesus that many of us think of when we think about Jesus. We have a woman who has come to him with her daughter who needs healing. And rather than Jesus immediately saying yes and immediately healing her and being the Jesus of radical inclusion and radical love, he turns her away initially because she is not of the correct religious, cultural identity. That is deeply unsettling. And there are a few ways, there are some kind of default moves that people make in order to try to make sense of this passage, right? I think there are the people who would say, well, Jesus didn't really do anything wrong. Jesus wasn't being a racist here. Jesus wasn't being exclusionary. He was trying to test the woman's faith to see how she would respond, which that version of Jesus actually sits with me a lot worse, to think that Jesus would test and toy with a frightened and grieving mother. And then there is the move that it's especially pushing against those of us who were perhaps raised where, with the idea that Jesus had to be, perfect, sinless, without any fault, to say, well, maybe that's the idea that we need to let go of, right? That actually sitting with Jesus's imperfection here is helpful. And I think there's some truth to, right? There is something helpful there to be gleaned. But I think to shift the language a little bit, rather than saying Jesus is not perfect, so we need to let go of that idea of Jesus, actually using that as an opportunity to unpack what we even mean when we talk about perfection and what is the model of perfection that we are called into as those of us who would seek to be followers of Jesus. And I know that I've spoken quite a lot about how much I love Mark, because I think Mark is just the most tightly structured of all of the Gospels. But it's great. And this passage follows, those of you who were here last week, the text was Jesus meeting the religious leaders of his day who were consumed with purity, consumed with how they wash their hands and their dishes before they eat, and Jesus giving that famous line, it's not what goes out of you that comes it's not what comes from without that defiles a person, but what comes from within, right? And pushing against this notion of purity and righteousness that's about keeping ourselves protected from the world, but in fact being called into love and openness and reconciled relationships with the world. And I think that carries this on, right? And what is modeled here from Jesus is not that kind of static, autonomous, individualistic perfection, but a dynamic of being willing to hear, to engage, the humility of being transformed, of seeing a woman who would initially have been considered on the outside of his mission and ministry and being challenged such that his vision of his faith and calling and teaching is transformed. And for me, that is even a more powerful dynamic than the static, perfect Jesus, because it's pretty transformative. And if we think about what Jesus is called to demonstrate and embody and reveal to us about God, it is the God who is not static and distant and separate from us, but the God who is poured out wholly in radical, risk-taking love for us, and choosing to share in the messiness and the complexity and the danger of our human condition. And that is what we are called to participate in. And I think it's very telling then that in Mark's version of this story, it's paired then so immediately with Jesus, in the language of the text, opening the ears of this man who is deaf, opening him up to being able to relate and engage with the world in a whole and radical way. Because that was what we were called to, is openness. And I think what's so vital about us hearing that message is that there are so many ways in which our striving to be perfect according to this like hyper individualized, hyper static notion of perfection is so contrary, in fact, to actually that call to openness and love and transformation and the messiness of the world, right? And we certainly know that when we are called, let's talk about the world of toxic perfectionism, meet Kenyon College. Uh, but that pursuit of perfection, accomplishment, success, like achievement, is so often actually destructive to our relationships. Just ask Lehman for like enlightenment as to what undergraduate Rachel was like. I've been there. But I think there's much more insidious and toxic ways this feeling like we have to be perfect all of the time really consumes us and is deeply insidious. We know that the world is in many ways, dare I say it, a dumpster fire, right? Here we are again in online church because we are still trapped in this pandemic, and there is so much that we know that is so broken in our world. And yet, I think one of the things that's particularly challenging for us is the pressure that we apply to ourselves and that often others that we apply to one another to always have the right response and the right take and the right answer to every single one of these issues and challenges and problems of our world, right? The pressure to always have the right perfectly framed post for social media, engaging with whatever the issue is that needs to be engaged with at a given time. The fear that perhaps many of us feel about not being utterly perfect in our language and our response, the fear of being called out. And I think what is so insidious about that, right? Because it's not bad to want to make sure to think about how we respond and engage with the world and think deeply about the issues that are vital and important to us. But when we are so consumed with our response and making sure that our responses are perfect, that our take is perfect, that our platform is perfect, and that we are engaging all of the time in the right way, how much does that actually mean that we're fixated on ourselves? And how much does that, in fact, actually close ourselves off to really sitting with in powerful ways the complexity and the messiness of the world, to hear and receive what challenges us and what has the capacity to transform us, and instead remain trapped in our little pockets of righteousness. And I don't have easy answers to that. I really don't, because our world is really, really, really challenging right now. And perhaps I'm going to leave off this very unsettling gospel in a fairly unsettled place. But as I hear this text, right, and I hear this woman who is crying out for her child, I can't help but resonate with a parent who's crying out for the healing of their, the safety and the protection and health of their child right now, as many other parents are doing, sending our unvaccinated children off into schools in the middle of the pandemic. And I think about the backlash, the defying all reason, violent backlash that has been laid against those of us who advocate for masks in our schools. You know, the allegations that we just care about control, veering up to just like wild lies. And I find myself wanting to scream. Like, do you not know how scared can you not acknowledge my pain and fear for my child? And even at the same time, I know that those people who are so violently angry at me, I know deep in my heart that they're scared as well and actively truly believe that masks are harming their children. And I don't have easy answers for what it means to bridge that chasm, what it means for us to bear with each other, what it means for us to hear and be open to each other. I wish that I did. And as I said, I feel like I am leaving off this unsettled text in a place unsettled myself. But while I don't have answers and I'm not sure what exactly our path forward is, what I do think about is what gives me hope and what gives me the strength to continue persevering one step at a time, which is I know that we have to, beyond all else, be called into love for one another and to move forward with grace and compassion in this world that is so broken. And while we might not be able to come to easy solutions, how transformative it would be to be able to bear with each other, to grant grace to those who challenge us, and to live in the model of the God whose love is messy and is dynamic and bears with us in the complexity and challenges of our lives.